Alright, you guys, we got a real treat today. So, I've already made a video using the demonstration and sales training video from 1975 for the Sony Betamax VTR. Here's a little history lesson. Why is it called VTR? Why are you saying that, Michael? Because JVC patented VCR for the VHS, video cassette recorder. VTR stands for video tape recorder. Sounds stupid, but you know, that's the way it is in the legal world. So, we're going to watch a show that I love watching on YouTube. Shout out to this guy who's going to be talking to us from Technology Connections. He did a special on the Betamax. I would like to share it with you now. He talks about a lot of stuff that I just don't have the means to, and he has visuals and all that kind of stuff. I don't have a Betamax anymore, so I have no visuals. I will be watching this with you. You will see me up in the corner there, and I will say some things. I will stop him while he's talking because he is a lot younger than I am. He was not there for all of what he's talking about. I was. So I'm giving you a person with experience's perspective. He's just going by the stuff that he's read online and the history books and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to tell you the perspective from someone who was there. Not a knock. Again, I love Technology Connections. That's why I'm using this. I'm putting both of our arts together and making something beautiful. So let's start this up, man. This is about the Sony Betamax VTR.
Say it's 1979 and you've just decided to blow 2 whole paychecks on one of these newfangled video cassette recorders. Congratulations on your life-changing decision. But now comes the time to ask yourself, which one should you buy? 2 systems are vying for your money, each packing their own set of unique features. A format war is a brewing. How do you know which choice is the right one? Since a startlingly large percentage of viewers may have never used or even seen a video cassette recorder, let's just throw it in your face and make clear that we are talking about the format war between VHS, the winner, which was released in 1976 and that stayed relevant until around 2003, and Betamax, the loser, which actually predated VHS by a year, but became the butt of jokes by the late 1980s. The format war between Beta and VHS is widely studied even today in business classes the world over. In this video, we'll explore the history of the format war, and I'll be comparing 2 machines which were both on sale in 1979. And I think by the end, you'll be able to see why VHS left Beta in the dust. Quick side notes, this video discusses the format war as it took place from the perspective of the United States. As such, Philips' excellent and revolutionary Video 2000 format, which never made it to the US, is not being included. Beta was not the first consumer video cassette format. That title goes to Philips' VCR format, unless you count the professional U-matic, but Philips was ultimately unsuccessful. Betamax is regarded as the first consumer format to achieve any sort of widespread success. Here we are, the pinnacle of modern engineering. You can even smell it. Trust me, these machines smell groovy. On the left, we have an RCA VDT-600, a fully featured VHS model built in Japan by the Matsushita Corporation, the parent of Panasonic, under license from the Japan Victor Company, or JVC, the inventors of VHS, and branded and sold by the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA. Pay attention to that jumbled mess of a who built it, because it will be important later. On our right, we have a Sony SL5400, a high-end Betamax model, which came to be known later simply as Beta, made in Japan by Sony, for Sony, and sold as a Sony. Glad we got that out of the way. So let's start with a physical overview of these 2 machines. In the looks department, I'd say this is somewhat of a tie. The Sony doesn't exactly look sleek. In fact, it looks kind of like a giant brick.
No, I think the Sony looks a lot better than that VHS.
And the no-nonsense style almost makes it handsome. The clock is very clear and attractive, with a charming programming display, and the buttons are labeled on both the top and the edge. The RCA, on the other hand, looks a fair bit bulkier, but you could say more interesting. Its sloping front allows the clock timer to be seen both from the front and a top-down view, and helps to minimize its bulky appearance. But the buttons are far clunkier, with weird color choices for their top.
That thing is ugly.
RCA's decision to use mixed case font for labeling makes the machine appear perhaps a little less professional, but almost gives it some modern-day charm. Tuning channels is accomplished on the RCA behind this front panel, where you'll also find the tracking knob. Channel tuning on the Sony is done up top. See, in these days, electronic tuners were hella expensive. So instead, VCRs had either big old knobs like this one, or they'd have a series of tiny mechanical tuners each tied to a button. You'd pick which 14 or so channels you'd want to be able to record, and set them with these little switches and thumb wheels.
Do you notice that it had a VHF and a UHF wheel? Cable was not a standard thing when those VCRs hit the market. So you were expected to hook them to your TV, and your TV, at that time, most TVs provided the antenna. They were built in, and you just ran it through the VCR. So you were recording off of over-the-air television. It's just the way it was. There was no cable on the first VCRs. Now later, when they started doing the front loaders and all that, those had digital tuners that did support cable TV. But the first models did not. They were strictly for over-the-air television. If you were going to use that with cable, you would have to hook your cable box to it. Because at that time, cable came with a box, a converter box, and all that mess. Just thought I'd throw that out there to you. Thank you.
Then you'd simply select between them with the buttons, with each button corresponding to one of these little doohickeys. Often, the VCR would come with replacement inserts to label these with the actual channel numbers. Sony gives you camera inputs on the front of the machine, but the audio input is strangely an 1/8-inch audio jack rather than a standard plug. RCA gives you standard connections, but they're in back. Interestingly, the Sony machine has hardly any LEDs used in its design. Apart from the timer program display for tape length and this one little indicator, all of the lights are either small incandescent bulbs, or in the case of the channel indicators, tiny green fluorescent lamps, similar to the ordinary orange neon lamp you find in a power strip, but with a green phosphor coating the inside of the glass envelope. The RCA model, on the other hand, makes extensive use of LEDs, the only incandescent bulb being located inside the cassette mechanism, working as part of the end-of-tape sensor.
More stuff to
Let's get all touchy-feely. When using these machines, there's a clear winner in the ergonomics department. The Sony was obviously designed to make the operational experience a pleasant one. The power switch moves silently, no click to be heard, but decisively with clear physical indentations between its positions. Each of the piano key buttons is easy to press, and when you press eject to raise the cassette tray, the machine seems to greet you with a fine, "May I have your cassette, sir?" When you lower the cassette into the machine, it immediately makes the most anticlimactic sound perhaps ever. That sound coming from the action of threading the tape. See, beta machines usually kept the tape threaded at all times, even during fast forwarding or rewinding, but there are exceptions, notably Sanyo-built machines. Again, pressing play takes little force, and as the tape is already threaded, you get a picture pretty quickly. Now, here's where the RCA machine starts to look bad. The power switch isn't quite so nice. It's not a bad switch, but it's not a satisfying one. It's just a switch.
It's ugly.
The red LED lights up, and for those wondering why there's an indicator for do, well, that's because these early VCRs were often lugged around with a camera to record life's precious moments, and RCA, Matsushita, added a do sensor to prevent operation of the machine if a cold VCR was brought into a warm, humid room.
Yeah, if you thought that the people in the mid-'80s with the VCR straps over their arm, if you thought they were crazy, try lugging that big SOB around. Jesus Christ!
Causing condensation to form on the delicate video heads. Pretty thoughtful, actually. Anyway, back to business. Pressing the eject button on this machine requires smashing your finger into the button like you smash X when playing Gran Turismo 3. Once you've hurt your finger enough to actually release the tray, the machine screams at you, "Give me a tape!" No money spent on dampers here. No, sir.
That'll break quick.
Lowering the tape into the machine does nothing. This machine won't do a thing until you press a button. Get ready, because that play button isn't any easier to press. Once you've jammed it in there, the machine then lazily threads the tape around the head drum, and eventually you get a picture.
I noticed it took a lot longer.
But we can overlook minor inconveniences if it's a more capable machine, right? Well, here's where things start to get interesting. Sony was already forced to play catch-up in 1979, and a lot of that had to do with the cassette itself. Speaking of, let's have a look at those. A VHS cassette is still a somewhat common sight, and you probably know what it looks like. Usually black, but not always. The cassette measures 187 millimeters wide, 103 deep, and 25 thick. 2 windows allow you to see the internal reels, so you can see how much tape is on each reel, and thus you can tell roughly where you are along the length of the tape. A very utilitarian design, the cassette just is. Nothing
I did
fancy
appreciate
here.
that.
The Beta cassette is a good deal smaller than the VHS cassette, with dimensions of 156 wide, 96 deep,
Which I
and 25
better.
thick.
It was more compact.
This would prove a fatal mistake, as you'll
But
soon
the
see.
window part,
The identical
I didn't
thickness
like
between
that. I
Beta
thought
and
the
VHS isn't
had
much of a
better
surprise,
look far
as both
that's
formats
concerned.
used half-inch wide magnetic tape. Design-wise, the Beta cassette is more visually interesting. Most Beta cassettes only had a window on the left-hand reel, allowing you to see how much tape was remaining, but not how much was used. I suppose Sony thought knowing how much tape was left was most important, but it was also annoying as hell. Case in point, particularly with pre-recorded tapes, you can't tell if a tape is rewound all the way. I know just by looking at this VHS tape that it's not quite at the beginning. But for Beta, the asymmetrical artsiness of the cassette means that you really don't know with certainty if that tape is completely rewound. But it wasn't just that annoying little quirk. In fact, most of Beta's problems came directly from this cassette design. Let's take a step back in time and go over a few things. When developing the format, Sony took the old adage of size matters the wrong way. See, Betamax was pretty much just a shrunken down version of U-matic, Sony's earlier 3/4-inch cassette format used in broadcasting. U-matic had a recording time of 1 hour, which was fine for television studios, as there would usually be multiple machines handling multiple tapes for things like commercial breaks, and there was always a broadcast technician able to switch between them and load up new tapes.
And they were 3 times the size of a VHS tape. They were huge. Go on Google and look up the Sony U-matic. They were huge.
Sony rather naively assumed that 1 hour was therefore a fine benchmark for a consumer format and kept that their goal for the Betamax machine. This went hand in hand with Sony's desire to keep the cassette on the smaller side. They used their company's handbook as a template for a convenient size. Trouble is, worrying about that was the very wrong thing to do. Sony released the Betamax system in 1975 with L500 tapes, the standard length that ran for 1 hour. L750 tapes were also available, which could run for an hour and a half, but that was it. So, in comes the revolutionary VCR, and early adopters were quickly annoyed with that 90-minute, at best, recording time. See, the whole point of a VCR is to allow you to record shows while you're not at home, preventing you from missing a show you really wanted to watch. A 90-minute recording time meant a lot of programs couldn't be recorded. For example, movies would routinely take up at least a 2-hour broadcast with commercial breaks built in. But this is America, damn it, and the most important thing we need to record is a football game. Obviously. That ain't gonna work with Beta. Meanwhile, JVC is busy developing their soon-to-be unveiled VHS format. Fun fact, VHS stands for Video Home System. You know, because that's definitely the order those 3 words belong in. Anyway, JVC's system used a larger cassette, which, guess what? Has more tape inside. This meant that right out of the gate, the VHS system had Sony beat with a 2-hour recording time on their standard T120 cassette. Let's take these cassettes apart and compare what we find on the inside. Obviously, these internal tape reels are way smaller on the Beta tape, so to have the same length of tape as this VHS cassette, the tape would need to be impractically thin.
Okay, as a kid I did a demonstration on this, so I'm going to throw this at you. The tape itself is exactly the same. The difference is the machine that you put it in, the way that it records on the tape. When I was a kid, I took a VHS shell and a beta shell, stupidly thinking, hey, why don't you put the beta tape in the VHS shell and then you could watch your beta tapes? Genius! And I broke our Hoover Bloob Highway tape doing this. I'm so stupid. But I did. I put the beta tape with the Hoover Bloob Highway on it into a VHS shell. Sealed it up and everything. And it looked like a VHS tape, right? I stuck it in the machine. And all I got was like a bunch of garbled audio and a gray screen with lines through it. The difference is in the recording signal that goes onto the tape. So you can't do things like that. If you recorded it in Beta 3, for instance, it has to be played back by a Betamax machine. Or if you recorded it on SLP on VHS, it has to be played on a VHS machine. If you swap carts and put that into a Beta cart and put it in a Betamax, you're going to get the same thing I got. Terrible picture, no sound, just awful. So I'm just throwing that out to you as a little fact he didn't mention. Sorry to interrupt.
Now, to be clear, the signals recorded on the tape aren't compatible in any way. The machines record onto the tape in very different fashions with incompatible signals, but as it's otherwise identical tape, the speed the tape runs through each format is pretty close, so the overall length of tape was the most important. Still, VHS did run a tad bit slower. Here are two blank tapes, one beta, one VHS. You'll see that the L750 cassette contains 222 meters of tape. The 750 means 750 feet. Remember, the L750 is the long version with thinner than normal tape, but this T120, the standard VHS length, has 24 more meters of tape. A T160, the most common long VHS cassette, has 327 meters of tape, almost 50% more than the L750. Sony did release the ultra-thin and somewhat rare L830, but this wasn't a huge deal as it only squeezed an extra 10 minutes of recording time on early machines. Just by the look of these tapes, Sony seemed to be at a huge disadvantage here.
Meanwhile,
the American company, RCA, had a rather large part in ensuring VHS would end up winning the format war. See, before Beta was even released, RCA was interested in building a videotape recorder of their own. But they heard about Sony's work on Betamax and decided that maybe it'd be better to just license the technology and ask Sony to build machines for them. But there were two problems. First was that Sony wasn't all that excited to build machines for other people, let alone let others build copies. And second was their stubbornness on recording time. RCA reps reportedly asked the Sony guys if a longer recording time was possible, and Sony said, maybe someday. Don't bother with these guys.
Yeah, that was a problem that Sony had. They wanted to own and run and make everything. They were like Prince. You ever looked at the back of a record jacket from Prince that says, produced, arranged, composed, recorded by Prince? They wanted to do everything themselves. They didn't want third-party people making the machines unless they got paid an asinine amount for it. And some people did. Sanyo obviously paid a huge amount. And I think Toshiba. But those are the only two companies I can point to that I remember that made Betamax machines. Now, VHS, on the other hand, every company out of the woodworks was making those, except for Sony in the beginning. When Sony lost the war in 1988, when it was announced that VHS had won, Sony finally started making VHS machines. But up until 1988, they were sticking with Beta, and they were very strong about it. I mean, I give them that credit, but it's kind of like Xbox and PlayStation. I hate to use that old analogy I keep using, but it's true. Anyways, continue, my man.
So, RCA found out about what JVC was doing. Already they were more excited about JVC's product because it could record 2 hours. RCA then asked if a longer recording time was possible, and JVC gave them a long, convoluted answer about reduced image quality, and maybe it's not such a good idea, but I guess, yes, it would technically be possible, but you'd have to keep that reduced picture quality in mind, to which RCA said, okay, sounds great, keep in touch.
Yes, one thing I can say about VHS and beta picture quality, after using both, on Betamax, whether you use beta, well, most machines I used only had the beta 2 and beta 3 speeds because beta 1 was deemed obsolete by like 1980. So by the time I was born, that was already obsolete. But beta 2 or beta 3, whichever one you used, you got the same picture and sound quality. It was pretty incredible. I couldn't tell the difference between anything recorded on either, which kind of makes me wonder, why did they bother with speeds? I mean, I get it. You wanted to use more of the tape, but it just goes to show you that Sony had a better technology. They knew how to squeeze 2 more hours on that tape without degrading picture quality or sound quality. Whereas with VHS, you could tell a major difference when you went from SP to LP, then to SLP, or sometimes referred to as EP. Every one of them degraded the picture and sound worse and worse and worse. That's where the Betamax was hailed as having the best picture and sound quality, because it did. You could use either speed that it offered and you got the same perfect, great picture and sound. It was fantastic. But again, you're dealing with VHS had a 6-hour tape and Betamax had a 4.5-hour tape. So, just throwing that at you.
Unlike the controlling Sony, JVC was totally cool with licensing the VHS patents to other companies, and shortly dozens of names would appear on VHS machines. Like this one, Matsushita made RCA's first Selectavision VCR, and although JVC still warned them about doing so, RCA had Matsushita produce the recorders with an LP or long play recording mode, which cut the tape speed in half and thus doubled the recording time. RCA thought this was imperative to having a successful product, as 4 hours was a pretty typical length for a broadcast football game. And guess what? They were right on the money. As soon as RCA went public in 1977 about their upcoming VCR with this amazing 4-hour recording capability, Sony executives gave a collective and scrambled to come up with a solution. So what did they do? Well, they just ripped off RCA's technique and introduced a new tape recorder with the X2, later called Beta 2, recording speed. Now, an L500 tape could hold 2 hours of video, and an L750 could hold 3. Yay. But that's still not as good as RCA's machine, and now is where things start to get interesting. These two machines reveal the tit-for-tat, look-what-I-can-do nature of the format war in its early stages. RCA kept pushing the importance of recording time, and this machine has the brand new whiz-bang SLP speed, which allows for a whopping 6 hours of recording time on a T120 tape, 8 hours on the slightly thinner T160. Sony wouldn't leave this unanswered and released the Beta 3 recording speed, which pushed the L750 tape to 4.5 hours recording time. Still not that great though. So what did they do? Well, this machine marks the beginning of Sony's desperate attempts to find a way to wow buyers with new exciting features that might let people overlook the shorter recording time. You'll notice this machine proudly proclaims Beta Scan. Well, what does that mean? Well, all video recorders before this very model had to blank the screen when fast-forwarding or rewinding. On this VHS machine, you have to press stop, wait for the tape to unthread, and then you can fast-forward or rewind. Then you press stop, then play, and
I
hope you're in the
loved
right
Beta
place.
Scan.
But Beta Scan lets you see on the screen a fast motion image, showing you exactly where you are along the tape. Revolutionary.
End of Queen's Parade and then just somewhere. I mean, where are the pens? I mean,
While
would you
this
believe
feature
it?
would eventually become a staple of the VCR from both Beta machines and VHS models, once VHS manufacturers figured out how to copy Sony's work, which didn't take long, it was at the time kind of a grasping at straws gesture. Again, you've got to put yourself in the mindset of consumers at the time. These machines are here to save you from the deep, dark despair that consumes you when you've missed your TV show. Betascan was more of a neat trick at this point. What's most important to consumers is the machine's flexibility at recording shows. And here's where the Sony machine falls flat on its face. Okay, we're going to need to pause here. There's a lot to digest from this format war, so I'm going to split it here into two parts. In the next video, we'll be discussing how Sony seemed to think they could decide what their customers wanted. This led them to a position where they were always a step ahead of VHS when it came to technical feats, but often a step behind when it came to everyday features that their buyers really needed. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I humbly ask that you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Technology Connections. As you know, I'm doing my best to keep videos like this headed your way. I'll see you next time. This video is part 2 of an exploration on why Sony's Betamax video recording format lost to the more ubiquitous
next time
VHS.
came quick, huh?
We were comparing these two machines, and we saw how Sony had introduced Betascan, but they had overlooked something.
This together.
Here comes a link to get to part 1. We left off with me saying that this machine falls flat on its face. What's most important to consumers is the machine's flexibility at recording shows. And here's where the Sony machine falls flat on its face. See, that's where we left off. Now, in addition to spending time and resources making new features that the buyer didn't know they needed, Sony also seemed to just keep flailing their arms about and making stupid decisions about other basic necessities, and it shows in this model. Initially, they thought things like timers were silly features to include in their machines. As Mark Weiledge and Rod Woodcock recall in their piece The Rise and Fall of Beta, one Sony executive, when asked why his machines didn't include a timer when the competition did, explained that having separate timers allows the consumer to use it for other purposes. And not everyone needs a timer. We don't force you to buy one. Yeah, no. While it may sound noble, the whole damn point of a VCR is to time shift, recording things when you're not there. That's not possible without a timer, so selling it as an add-on is only going to piss people off and look like a money grab. Great job, guys. While they did eventually come around and include a timer in most of their machines, the timers weren't nearly as advanced as what the competition offered. The Sony unit has a 3-day, 1-event timer. Take a look. Programming is pretty simple. You just hold down the program button and pick a time. Then you select what day, either today, tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow. And lastly, you choose how long you want it to record for.
They were perfectly fine.
Once you've punched that in, you select the channel you want it to record, hold down the record button, and move the power switch to timer. Not too difficult, but also not too impressive. Let's hope you're not gone longer than a weekend. And let's hope there's only one program you want to record. The RCA model, meanwhile, has a 4-event, 7-day timer, and it's actually less frustrating to program as you don't have to hold a button down while making adjustments at the same time. Turn the selector from manual to program, then select which program, A, B, C, or D, you want to input. First you pick the day. 0 is today, 1 tomorrow, 2 the day after tomorrow, etc. I'll admit that's not as easy to work out as Sony's in-your-face wording, but it's way more capable. Also, A means it will record every day. That means one program can actually create multiple daily recordings, which is pretty neat. This lever switches between the start time and how long you want it to record for.
To be honest, I don't think any of this mattered at all.
Set the time to 4, turn this to select the length, and then put in an hour and 30 minutes. This is way more versatile than the Sony, as you might want it to start recording a minute before your show starts and stop a minute afterwards to make sure nothing is missed. You're not limited to the 30-minute increments like here on the Sony model. But the most important way this machine kicks the pants off the Sony is here. Notice how the channel is flashing. It wants you to select it. That's right, the RCA machine will change channels for you. So the Sony machine has Betascan, but the RCA can record for 6 hours on 4 different programs over a week and even change the channel for you. Which one would you buy? Sony just didn't seem to get it. They released this device with virtually no regard to how their buyers would actually use it. The reason people flocked to recording time wasn't simply that they wanted the machine to be able to record a very long program like a football game. It was also that they wanted it to be able to record a lot of different programs in one go.
Like I said, I don't think any of this really mattered. I experienced all this. That kind of stuff with the timer recordings, it was what it was. We didn't have digital stuff like we do now, DVRs and all that kind of stuff. It was all analog, doing it all like set it for Tuesday, 3 o'clock p.m. I wanted to go for 4 hours. That's the way that it was. We didn't have titles on the screen of shows to just record every day or every week. You know, it just didn't exist. The technology wasn't as advanced. I think he's younger than me, a lot younger. He didn't experience this. I did, and I disagree with him on this part. I would still buy the Sony Betamax over the VHS machine, hands down.
A 6-hour recording time means 3 one-hour shows, and an entire weekday lineup of half-hour daily programming could be recorded on a single tape with room to spare. But to do that automatically, you need a timer that can start more than just one recording. So while Sony caved and produced the Beta 3 speed, it was rather obtuse to not also add a complicated timer that can manage more than one program.
See? Sony eventually got that, and it worked out fine, didn't it?
Now to be fair, this RCA machine was probably a little more expensive than the Sony. Poking around online shows that the Sony retailed for, are you sitting down, $1,250. And although I don't have a firm price for the RCA model, this price chart from Popular Mechanics shows the Panasonic PV1600, probably the exact same machine internally as this one given its features, at $1,295. But this is for the absolute whiz-bang most complicated VCR on the market. As their ads proclaimed, no one gives you more VCR than RCA. But what about lesser models? Remember, I said that jumbled mess of how this machine came to be built was important. That's because JVC was super okay with other companies paying them a licensing fee to make their own VHS machines.
Okay, and I'm going to point this out because I know y'all are going to say, why would you buy the Beta? He just explained that the VHS had better features. I'm not necessarily a guy that just, okay, it's longer tapes, it's better. I've got to get the longer tape. No, I appreciate picture quality. I appreciate ease of convenience features and things like that. So for me, the Betamax would have still been my preferred choice. Whether it won a war or not, it would have served me in what I wanted it to do. And Betamax to me was just a lot better than any VHS VCR on the market at that time. It served me a lot better.
And thus tons of companies offered VCRs, from the most basic machines with a mechanical clock timer to the crazy advanced ones like these. This meant there was a lot of competition between manufacturers, and prices for VHS machines tended to stay lower than their Beta counterparts.
Now, having said that, what I just said, I understand why VHS won. I'm not discrediting that. I'm not some fanboy going, no, it's better. No, I understand. VHS offered a lot more and more people wanted that. That's fine. For me, I preferred Betamax. That's all. I know it failed. I know that it had its shortcomings, but it had certain things that VHS did not, and I appreciated those. So, just putting that out there.
A VHS model sporting a 3-day one-event timer like this Beta model may have cost a few hundred less. In fact, this chart shows a Panasonic unit available for $995, although it can't record at the SLP speed. Not that that mattered all that much, as a T160 at LP was still more recording time than an L810 at Beta 3. Now, Sony did eventually come around and produce Beta machines for others. For example, Sony produced some machines under the Zenith name, and they didn't all-out refuse to allow licensing. Sanyo and Toshiba both made Beta machines later on, as well as others. But the menagerie of VHS VCRs to choose from kept manufacturers of that system in a price war with each other, and thus it was very common for a similarly spec'd VHS machine to cost hundreds of dollars less than a Beta model. Was Sony completely wrong to avoid licensing? Perhaps not. The price war amongst VHS manufacturers meant they had to cut costs to compete with each other, and thus the machines tended to be less well made than Beta machines, with some cut corners. but usually they were just as reliable as Sony's machines, and details like a dampened cassette drawer and soft touch buttons don't mean much to the shopper if you can save a few $100 by avoiding them. Plus, the intense competition between VHS manufacturers meant they had to compete with each other on features as well. So these companies were quickly learning what features mattered most to consumers, like decent timers, whereas Sony just kept chugging along doing their thing without stopping to ask what the consumer actually desired. So again, which one of these two machines would you buy? This RCA unit with its extremely versatile timer and 6-hour recording time?
No, I would still buy the Sony Betamax. Did you see how flimsy that top was on that VHS machine? Betas weren't built like that, and I appreciate that. Look, I buy Apple products. I'm willing to spend more for top quality. And that's one thing that Sony always provided was top quality. They always had better products at high quality than their competition. Yes, their competition was cheap, but you got what you paid for. You knew that your beta VCR was going to last a long time. That VHS would probably be dead in 2 years. They just weren't as good because the cheaper they got, the cheaper that they were making them. Hence, I don't have a PC. I have a computer, or I have an Apple Mac computer. The Mac Mini from 2020, and I'll get the next one that comes out. I have Apple iPhone, Apple TV. I'm an Apple product guy because Apple offers fantastic products with great high quality. That's just the way it is, you know. Sorry if that angers people. That's just the way it is.
Or the Sony with its one-event timer, 4.5-hour recording time, and nice eject mechanism. Oh, and don't forget, Betascan. But my favorite detail about this machine in particular is the recording speed selector. Notice how it chooses between Beta 2 and 3. Where's 1? Sony basically admitted, in 1979 mind you, they effed up, by proclaiming, well, we know Beta 1 is useless, so let's just not let you use it anymore. This was only 4 years after the entire format was released. This model has a switch to let you use Beta 1, but it's located on the back under this cover because they really just don't want you to think about it anymore. This is particularly hilarious because the Beta 1 speed offered a better picture quality than VHS SP, which led many people to sing praises about Beta's better picture. But since Beta 2 became the standard, it was essentially like recording on VHS LP all the time, so the quality became pretty similar. In fact, you could say Beta 2 looks and sounds, given the slower linear tape speed of non-hi-fi machines, slightly worse than VHS SP.
That is not true. Beta 2 looked like VHS SP, and it had fantastic sound. You know, I mentioned this in the last video, but I guess I'll mention it here too. Betamax was the only system to offer digital sound. Now, of course, that came later in the 80s. That wasn't back in the early 80s and late 70s. But as far as picture and sound go, Betamax kept evolving and offering more great things. Now, VHS would copy them less than a year later, usually. But there was one feature that they could not copy, and that was digital sound. When Betamax created Beta Hi-Fi, less than a year later, VHS Hi-Fi was on the market. But when Beta created digital sound, VHS never did copy that because it was impossible. It had to do with Sony and their technology. You know, I preferred the mini disc over the compact disc. To give you an idea of how I think, the mini disc was like super small, and it was kept in a cartridge. It looked like an old floppy disk for a computer. It had the top thing that opened when you put it in the player, and it was a teeny tiny disc. they did that because it was so small. If you scratched it at all, the whole thing would probably be unplayable. But they had the same exact quality as a compact disc, and just listening to them, you couldn't tell the difference. Sony lost that war too, based on marketing, most likely, in my opinion, because that was a far superior product. For one, you could record on them. CDRs didn't exist. You could not record on compact discs. And the way they were advertising it, you could hook a CD player up to a mini disc recorder and basically make an exact duplicate of that compact disc on this little disc that was unscratchable and take it anywhere you wanted. They had portable players that ran off batteries, all that stuff, before CD players had it. So, but I'm getting off the topic here. I apologize for that. I'm just giving you a glimpse into somebody with experience with this stuff. He's telling you from a historical perspective. I was there. So let's continue.
Interrupt this program for a quick message.
Okay, you can't say things like that without some people losing their minds in the comments. Here's some footage recorded on a VHS VCR at the SP speed. Okay, now here's the same footage on beta at beta 2. Now here they are side by side. I will admit that this is using a newer VHS machine than the beta one, not that that's a huge surprise since VHS machines were made long after beta machines, and the beta machine isn't in perfect shape, but it still looks pretty similar. Oh, and sound. Here's a clip from VHS SP.
I love his
now beta
music.
2.
This is beta 2, I'm sorry.
So decide for yourself. I'll upload another video with all of this footage and details on my methodology, and a little card will appear right about now if it's ready.
That looked and sounded exactly the same to me. Just saying.
Personally, I don't see a difference, and technical data is remarkably similar between the two. But I'll stay out of this. Go ahead and argue amongst yourselves, if you please. So, in 1979, just 4 years after its release, Beta was struggling to justify its existence. Now, you might think that Sony would try and find a way to differentiate Beta from VHS to give a concrete reason to buy a Beta machine. And try they did. But every time they offered a new feature, either they went about it in the complete wrong way and shot themselves in the foot, or VHS just copied it. For example, in 1983, Sony released Beta Hi-Fi. Look at us, they said, CD quality sound on videotape. VHS will never match that. Guess what? They did in 1984. Then in 1985, Sony released Super Beta, a slightly better picture quality standard, boosting image quality by shifting the Y carrier, whatever that means. VHS will never copy that. Guess what? They did, creating the VHS HQ standard. Now, to be fair, this wasn't nearly the improvement that Super Beta was, particularly since many manufacturers resisted VHS HQ implementation due to cost, and JVC was forced to reduce the minimum specs for it.
And he did not mention digital sound. That was just Beta Hi-Fi and VHS Hi-Fi. Digital sound was a whole new thing. There was a button on the recorders. You could record in digital sound on Betamax VTRs. As a matter of fact, I knew people that had betas that would record CDs onto beta tapes because that gave you practically the same sound quality over what recording it onto a cassette would give you. Because, of course, back in these days, CD recorders didn't exist. And in the time he's talking about, the mini disc didn't exist either. It was strictly, if you wanted to record a CD, you did it the same way you did a record. You grabbed that blank cassette tape. So when the digital sound betas came out, people started using those to record CDs on until eventually recordable CDs came out and media for that purpose.
But still. Interestingly, VHS actually far and away leapfrogged Super Beta with the introduction of Super VHS. I wonder where they got the name for that. Or SVHS in 1987. SVHS was an almost 60% increase in resolution over standard VHS, much more than the 20% improvement achieved by Super Beta. Sony wouldn't match that until the next year with Extended Definition Beta, actually called ED Beta, a fitting name given how difficult it seemed for Sony to produce a meaningful rise in sales. Really though, both Super VHS and ED Beta weren't ever all that relevant due to their high cost compared to their standard counterparts. But one of Sony's ultimate missteps was their idea of a camcorder, Beta Movie. Sony figured that the smaller cassette of Beta would work to their advantage, allowing them to create a smaller all-in-one camera than the competition. Great. While their camera was pretty small for its time, they had to sacrifice a lot to make it work, namely, the ability of the camera to play a tape back. They performed some weird technical magic to shrink the video transport down to where it could record onto the tape in a very weird fashion that would work fine once removed from the camera and placed in a normal VCR.
That did suck. That was bad. That's where the Betamax did suck. You could not watch the tape through the camera. There was no viewfinder, really. There was a little hole that you looked into, and you were just seeing what you were shooting, you know. You couldn't actually run the tape back and edit it and all that. With the VHS ones, again, eventually, with the VHS ones, they had all kinds of features in those. They came out with the camcorder, okay? See, Beta only made this one type of camera. So VHS bested that shortly after, and Beta just kind of threw the camera idea away. You didn't see any more Beta cams or anything like that because it was pointless. VHS won that battle of the video camera for sure. My dad had one that you could record. Of course, you look through the viewfinder and you see what you're looking at. But when you were done, you could also reverse it. You could play it back and watch the tape through the viewfinder so that you could do proper editing and all that kind of stuff. It was really unique. It was still black and white what you were looking at through the viewfinder, but hey, I mean, at least it was letting you edit things and you could know what you were doing, you know. You couldn't do that with the Betacam or Beta Movie. Those were terrible.
But which could not be played back by the very device that recorded it. I'm sorry, but that's pretty stupid. Since there was no ability to review what you recorded in camera, Sony also decided that an electronic viewfinder wasn't necessary and instead just gave you an optical one. So not only could you not be sure if the shot was in focus or if exposure was okay while recording, but you would have no way of reviewing your footage till you could get home and pop the tape in your VCR. As you can imagine, sales weren't great. Meanwhile, JVC actually had a pretty clever idea and created the VHS-C format in 1982, which were small cassettes that only held a half hour of footage at SP speed, 90 minutes at SLP, but which contained honest-to-goodness VHS recordings on them.
Yes, I had a VHS-C as well eventually in the early 2000s because I had an adapter. It was a VHS-sized cartridge, and you put that little tape you're seeing that he's holding right there in that thing, and the tape would spread out in the cartridge, and it would turn it into a regular-sized VHS tape, and you could put it in any VHS VCR and play it back. I used to make tapes. That was my favorite camcorder, was the VHS-C. I remember I took that thing everywhere to people's houses, just filming stuff. Like, okay, New Year's 2004 at my friend Guy's house. A matter of fact, I took that thing to Branson, Missouri, and I shot vacation footage on it, even Andy Williams a little bit on the stage with it. but I don't have the ability to play that back anymore. I don't even know if my parents still have that tape. Who knows? Because I don't have it. You know, technology changed and all that stuff went away. We use our phones now. You know, our phones are video recorders. And then there's YouTube. See, none of that existed back then. So, just giving you my perspective here.
These cameras were smaller than Sony's incredibly dumb beta movie, and the machines could play the tapes back. Best of all, they simply go into an adapter for playback in a normal VCR. Sony wishes they thought of that for sure. Sony eventually released the Video 8 and then High 8 formats, which were formidable competitors to VHS-C. But since no one in their right mind would purchase a dedicated Video 8 VCR, you'd have to watch your movies with the camcorder plugged into the TV, or you'd have to dub them from the camcorder to a standard VCR, which reduced the qualities of the second generation copy. I'll tell you, my family was on Team VHS-C, and we have the bins of tapes to prove it. High 8 produced a much sharper picture than VHS, but again, unless you wanted to plug your camcorder into your TV every time you want to watch home movies, you'd have to dub it onto a normal tape anyway.
Sony always bested any competition. Let's just get that out of the way. Yes, I am a Sony fanboy. Look what they're doing to Xbox right now.
In retrospect, it seems like Sony kept failing to put themselves in their customers' shoes. Right from the start, they were doomed because of their small cassette. If they had done research to determine how people would actually use a VCR, they probably would have found that recording time was most important, and they probably would have taken the effort to have a sophisticated timer. So if the beta cassette had been made with VHS-like capacity, it's likely beta would have won the war. After all, they had a year's head start. But people flocked to VHS because it was simply more flexible. Impressive trick features and niceties like the featherlight buttons are of no use if the machine doesn't do what you need it to do. By the mid-1980s, sales between beta and VHS were pretty lopsided. Far more people owned VHS machines than beta. Naturally, when pre-recorded tapes with movies and whatnot began to be sold under the brand new product category called home video, sales of VHS copies were always stronger than beta. This led economies of scale to rear its ugly head, and for movie studios, producing beta copies of their latest home release was more expensive than VHS. So, either movie studios had to charge more for beta, which was unpopular and only further annoyed beta loyalists, or they simply made less profit on each beta sale, which annoyed shareholders. By the late 1980s, most movie studios had decided to altogether give up releasing their films on beta. Not good. To many people, 1988 marked the end of beta, as this was the year that Sony caved and started marketing their own VHS machines. The history of the videotape format war is interesting, but in my view, hilariously one-sided. Sure, Sony was first to market, but they just kept screwing up. It's like watching a cartoon where the protagonist repeatedly slips on a banana peel. Is it fair to say it was all Sony's fault? Not really. After all, VHS kept copying their developments, but Sony trapped themselves with this cassette. 4.5 hours is not enough. Even the name wasn't a good idea. Beta kind of implies second, as in second best, the fallback, the reserve, number 2, the alternative option. Alpha might have been better, hell, even epsilon, anything but not quite first. And there were plenty of annoying little details that plagued beta, like the one-sided cassette window and their strange decision to label tapes based on actual physical length and not recording time. Sony famously did win their second big format war back in 2006 when Blu-ray was fighting HD DVD, so at least we can say with a fair bit of certainty that they did indeed learn from their mistakes. Oh, and their 1982 release of a new product co-developed with Philips went very well for them. That new product, the compact disc, or CD. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I humbly ask that you hit that like button and subscribe to Technology Connections. I'm doing my best to keep videos like this headed your way. I'll see you next time.
Yes, interestingly enough, the CD was created by Sony as well. So when they put out the mini disc around 1992, 93, somewhere in there, they were really competing with themselves because they were trying to make the mini disc phase out the CD. but it didn't work. Sony's biggest problem is marketing. It's a hit or a miss with them. Obviously actually no. I always say Blu-ray won by default because Toshiba bowed out with the HD DVD format. The only reason Sony won that is because they bowed out way too early. Because everybody and their brother was saying during that war that HD DVD was going to win. It had an internet jack on the back of the machine, an Ethernet jack. You hooked it up to the internet, and they were able to send a lot more bonus features than what would have been on the disc to your player with the disc in the machine to stream to you. That was amazing technology at the time. Blu-ray machines didn't have that. They didn't hook to the internet. You bought a Blu-ray machine and you got what you got. You put the disc in there, you got what you got. With HD DVD, you could hook it up to the internet and get a slew of all kinds of extra features delivered online. So the HD DVD was poised to be a lot more tech savvy and tech advanced than Sony's Blu-ray. But Blu-ray did have a better picture. Here we go again. Sony products always had the best of the best. And that's why I tell you, I will always stick with Sony. In any war, in any format war, I will stick with Sony. I may lose. I understand that. I go into it understanding that. But I will stick with Sony. And if I want the other product, I'll buy it too. Like when HD DVD and Blu-ray were battling, I bought both. So some of my friends had HD DVD, some had Blu-ray. When they wanted to come over to my house and drink and party, I could play both of them. I'd say, just bring your movies. I can play any of them. But that's the way I think. I'm just throwing that out there. I will always support Sony. I think Sony is the best. And look, I had mini disc at the time. My father bought me a mini disc player in the mid-90s as a Christmas present. It was a recorder, so I was in my room. I would borrow friends' CDs and I would record them on the mini discs. And that was basically a perfect copy for me. I preferred the mini disc over the compact disc. But I never got rid of my compact discs because, again, it's a war and you have to understand that one of these is going to lose. And you'll be left with something that's unusable when that's done. So, Like with video games, I've got all three consoles. The Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 5, and the Xbox Series S. Because they all make exclusive games, and I want all the games. So... I got to get all of them, Now, in the case of video games, there's not going to be a loser necessarily. It would just be this one lags behind the other because there's no loser in video games. Because all that stuff evolves rapidly anyway. But with video and audio formats, there's always a clear winner and a clear loser. And there's always a format war with that stuff, Although I think the format war days are over now that everything is streamed online with the Apple Musics and the Spotify's and all that for music. And with movies, there's Vudu, Apple TV, Prime Video. So I think the days of those wars are over. But, that's a part of history, and I was there for it. I was there during the Beta and VHS war. And I was there for the HD DVD and Blu-ray war. I was also there for the CD and mini disc war. I experienced all this stuff. So I hope I was able to give you some excellent perspective on that. And I just hope I entertained you if you were interested in that subject. Y'all have a great night, and thank you for watching.